The palace corridors were quiet that morning, unusually so, as if the vast estate itself had sensed the weight of the day to come. Sunlight filtered through the tall, arched windows, casting pale rectangles of light across the polished marble floors. The air carried a faint chill, mingled with the scent of polished wood and the subtle perfume that always clung to the queen. Thomas Hale, a veteran guard with decades of experience, moved with deliberate care, boots muffled against the stone. His eyes were sharp, trained to notice every flicker of movement, every shadow that seemed out of place. Today was not a routine day. Rumors had circulated among the staff of a private ceremony the queen had scheduled, a gathering not listed on the palace calendar, held in secret and shrouded in mystery. Even the senior aides had been vague about its purpose. Thomas, though deeply loyal, felt an instinctive unease. He had learned long ago that secrecy within the palace could often hide motives darker than they seemed. And nothing about the queen's unusual arrangements today felt benign. He paused outside the ceremonial hall, the ornate doors rising twice his height, carved with symbols of the royal lineage. The faint echo of Camilla's voice drifted from within, low and measured, directing attendants and aides. Thomas pressed a gloved hand against the doorframe, listening. The words were indistinct, but the tone carried an unmistakable edge, authoritative, unyielding, and determined. He adjusted the strap of his ceremonial sword, aware that his duty extended beyond mere observation. Protecting the queen, ensuring decorum, and safeguarding the integrity of the palace were his responsibilities, but something in the air suggested that more would be required of him today. Inside, the room was prepared with meticulous care. Candles flickered in golden sconces, their flames reflected in polished silver platters and delicate crystal vases. A small group of aides and attendants hovered at the edges, faces tense, their movements careful, precise, as though any misstep could trigger disapproval or worse. On a low dais at the center of the room, Queen Camilla stood in her ceremonial robes, a heavy cloak of deep emerald trimmed with gold, jewels glinting faintly against the morning light. Her posture was perfect, commanding, but Thomas's trained eyes caught the tension in her shoulders, the subtle twitch of a finger as she adjusted a delicate necklace. Something was off. Thomas stepped forward, offering a respectful nod. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, voice calm but steady. "All preparations are in order." The queen turned slowly, her eyes sharp and calculating, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied smoothly. Her tone was polite but distant, the kind of measured civility that concealed deeper intentions. "This ceremony is personal. I trust you will ensure discretion and order." The word personal lingered, a subtle warning that this was not just another official event, but something private and potentially fraught. He acknowledged with a subtle inclination of his head. Years of service had taught him that the Queen's private events often carried layers of meaning, and that discretion could be a matter of life and death within the palace walls. As the other staff moved to finalize arrangements, Thomas circled the hall, observing every detail, the placement of the chairs, the angles of light across the dais, the subtle positioning of attendants who seemed almost too alert, as if anticipating an audience beyond the visible. Every detail mattered. Every movement could hint at hidden intentions. Outside, the corridors remained silent, the palace holding its breath. Thomas felt the weight of the building press against him, the history of generations, the echoes of decisions made in rooms like this over centuries. Every step he had taken as a guard, every lesson passed down by the Hale family, had prepared him for moments like this, moments when duty demanded vigilance, courage, and moral clarity. And though the morning seemed calm, he sensed the storm gathering just beyond the ornate doors of the ceremonial hall. The queen raised her hand, signaling for the ceremony to begin. Thomas stepped back slightly, giving her space but keeping a clear line of sight to every participant. Candles flickered, shadows danced across walls, and the polished floors reflected the glint of the queen's jewelry. Her voice, when she spoke, was smooth and melodic, reciting words that seemed ceremonial. Yet Thomas could detect a subtle undertone, something heavier, darker, hidden beneath the elegance of her phrasing. He strained to listen, noting every nuance, every pause, every hesitation in the voices around him. The attendants shifted nervously, their eyes darting toward Thomas, silently acknowledging his presence as both protector and observer. The young aides seemed unsettled, their training insufficient to mask the tension coiling in their shoulders. Even the most senior staff, normally composed and precise, moved with a cautious deliberation that suggested they too sensed the unusual gravity of the day. Thomas understood instantly. The Queen's private ceremony, shrouded in secrecy and orchestrated with meticulous care, was about to take a turn that no one could have anticipated. Suddenly, a faint clatter echoed from behind the dais, drawing his attention. Thomas stiffened, every instinct alert. The Queen's eyes flicked toward the sound, her composure momentarily faltering, just enough to reveal the shadow of concern beneath her controlled expression. A young aide hurried forward, whispering something urgently, and Thomas's trained gaze caught the subtle exchange. A folded note, passed with haste, eyes wide with apprehension. Something unexpected had entered the ceremony. A disturbance that could escalate at any moment. Thomas's pulse quickened. He understood the stakes instantly. This was not simply a ceremonial disruption. It was a signal that the delicate balance of secrecy and authority had been threatened. He shifted slightly, ensuring he could intervene without drawing undue attention, hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword, not in aggression, but readiness. Every shadow, every movement, every whisper now carried amplified meaning. The Queen's personal ceremony, intended as a private and controlled event, had become unpredictable. Camilla's gaze met his, sharp and commanding. For a brief instant, Thomas could read the calculation in her eyes, the realization that her plan might be compromised. She did not speak, only held his gaze, an unspoken question lingering. Would he act if the moment demanded it? Years of training, loyalty, and inherited duty surged through him. He knew, in that instant, that the course of the ceremony, and perhaps the safety of the palace itself, depended on his judgment, courage, and readiness to intervene. A faint rustle from the far corner drew his attention. Another aide moved hesitantly, carrying a ceremonial object meant to be part of the ritual. Thomas's instincts told him the object was out of place, its presence potentially significant. His mind raced, weighing the consequences of action versus inaction. The Queen's private ceremony, already tense and charged, was now poised on the edge of a darker turn. One wrong step, one miscalculation, could unravel hours of preparation, reveal secrets, or endanger lives. And then, the first subtle sign of the unexpected. The Queen's voice faltered slightly, a crack in the polished veneer of control. The candles flickered, as if responding to the shift in energy within the hall. Thomas stepped forward, silent but ready, eyes fixed on the Queen, prepared to act the moment the situation escalated. He had been trained for moments like this, but never had a private ceremonial disruption carried stakes so profoundly intertwined with loyalty, secrecy, and potential danger. Outside the polished hall, the palace seemed to hold its breath. Every corridor, every window, every echo of footsteps carried tension like a living thing. Thomas knew that what began as a private ceremony could soon cascade into consequences that would ripple through the royal family. And as he adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes sharp, he understood the truth. Only vigilance, courage, and decisive action could prevent the private turning dark into disaster. In that suspended moment, the veteran guard readied himself. The Queen's private ceremony was about to take a turn that no one anticipated, and Thomas Hale, protector of the royal family, would step forward to confront whatever darkness emerged. Every instinct, every lesson, every oath he had sworn converged in that instant. The palace and the royal family it sheltered depended on him. Thomas Hale remained vigilant at the edge of the ceremonial hall, every muscle coiled and senses heightened. The soft rustle of silk and the faint metallic glint of ceremonial jewelry could not distract him from the tension that hung thick in the air. Even the flickering candlelight seemed charged, as if the room itself recognized that the carefully orchestrated private ceremony was poised to shift into something darker. The young aides moved nervously, their careful movements betraying their unease, and Thomas's eyes followed each one with unwavering focus, ready to intervene if necessary. The first subtle disturbance came in the form of a misstep almost imperceptible to anyone else, but glaringly obvious to a veteran guard. A tray of ceremonial items trembled in the hands of a junior aide, the polished silver catching the candlelight at an unnatural angle. The tray wobbled, and Thomas's instinct screamed. He shifted slightly, prepared to catch it, to prevent it from clattering to the floor and creating chaos. The Queen's eyes flicked toward the movement. Sharp and calculating, she masked her surprise with a calm expression. But Thomas could see the brief tightening of her jaw, the subtle narrowing of her eyes. Something had interrupted her control, and the ripple of unease began to spread through the hall. Then, from the far corner, a soft whisper carried across the room. Thomas's ears, honed over decades of guarding the royal family, caught the words before anyone else. Must proceed exactly as instructed, no deviations. The voice was low, hurried, and unmistakably anxious. It belonged to one of the aides, a junior staff member who had been tasked with delivering a ceremonial item. Thomas's eyes tracked the movement. The aide paused, glancing toward the Queen with visible worry, adjusting the way they carried the package as if it might slip from their grasp at any moment. A sudden draft rustled the heavy curtains near the dais. Thomas stiffened, moving subtly to ensure that the movement of air did not signal a more significant disturbance. His eyes flicked to the Queen. Camilla's hand hovered over a ceremonial chalice, her fingers brushing the polished surface with meticulous care. Yet her gaze was no longer entirely on the ritual. Something had shifted, an external element or internal unease had intruded into the ceremony. The veteran guard recognized it immediately. The controlled environment of her private event had been compromised, and the consequences could be serious if not addressed swiftly. Footsteps approached from the side corridor, soft but deliberate. Thomas's heart tightened. The sound was faint, but the weight of experience told him it was purposeful. Someone else had entered the palace quietly, moving with intent, likely drawn to the hall by the subtle disturbances or the unusual secrecy of the event. The Queen's expression remained poised, but Thomas could detect the flicker of recognition, the almost imperceptible glance that acknowledged the potential threat without revealing panic. He shifted slightly, placing himself between the dais and the outer corridor, eyes scanning for the source. A young page emerged, carrying a sealed envelope. His steps faltered as he approached the dais, and Thomas caught the hesitation immediately. The page's hands trembled ever so slightly, and the wax seal on the envelope gleamed ominously in the candlelight. Thomas's mind raced. He understood the significance. Any disruption, even small, could alter the course of the ceremony, revealing secrets or triggering panic among the staff. The Queen's voice, calm yet commanding, cut through the tension. Proceed with caution. Every action must follow the plan precisely. Her tone was firm, but her eyes flicked subtly toward Thomas, a silent acknowledgement that she was aware of the disturbances and perhaps relying on his vigilance to maintain order. Thomas nodded slightly in return, aware that he had become both protector and silent enforcer, his presence a stabilizing force amid the growing uncertainty. From the shadows, another movement drew his attention. A distant aide hesitated near the entrance, glancing nervously toward the center of the hall. Something about their posture, the slight trembling of their hands, suggested not incompetence, but fear of the unknown, of the consequences should the Queen's private ceremony spiral beyond her control. Thomas observed silently, noting the precise timing of each step, the careful placement of ceremonial items, the almost imperceptible exchange of glances. Every detail mattered. A soft, metallic click echoed faintly from the far side of the hall. Thomas stiffened instantly. The sound was subtle, but to someone trained in palace protocol, it carried significance. The Queen's ceremonial staff had been disturbed. The items on the trays, the placement of documents and artifacts, had shifted slightly. It was a small thing, almost trivial to a casual observer, but to Thomas it signaled that the event's integrity was at risk. He adjusted his stance, ready to move swiftly should the disturbance escalate into chaos. The tension in the room mounted as Camilla continued the ceremony. Her movements remained graceful, deliberate, and controlled, but the subtle cracks were becoming more evident. A slight faltering in her voice, a flicker of impatience in her gaze, the way she shifted her weight from one foot to another. Thomas's pulse tightened. He understood, as few could, the importance of maintaining stability not just for appearances, but for the safety of everyone present. Even the smallest disruption in such a meticulously orchestrated event could have ramifications far beyond the hall itself. Then, the first truly alarming sign. The junior aide carrying the ceremonial chalice froze mid-step. His eyes widened, and the tray trembled violently in his hands. Thomas moved instantly, stepping forward to intercept, but the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. The Queen's gaze cut toward him, and for a fraction of a second, the room seemed suspended in time. Thomas knew that if he did not act decisively, the minor disturbance could escalate into a full-blown mishap, undermining the ceremony and possibly revealing secrets better left concealed. He reached the aide just as the tray began to tip, steadying it with a firm but discreet hand. The metallic objects clinked softly, but none fell. Thomas's calm, veteran presence stabilized the moment, preventing panic and averting immediate disaster. The Queen's eyes met his again, a subtle acknowledgement of gratitude, but her expression remained guarded. She had expected control, not intervention, yet Thomas had ensured the continuity of the event without drawing attention. Outside the ceremonial hall, the palace remained quiet, the corridors echoing with the faintest sounds of footsteps and whispered words. Thomas understood that this was only the beginning. The disturbances he had observed, the trembling aides, the secret notes, the hesitant movements were all signs that the ceremony was on the edge of taking a darker turn. He knew instinctively that the next moments would demand not only vigilance but decisive action, courage tempered by experience, and moral clarity in the face of the unknown. As he straightened, adjusting his posture and scanning the room, Thomas realized the truth. The Queen's private ceremony, intended to be controlled and personal, had already begun to unravel. Subtle disturbances were no longer small, they were harbingers of conflict, and only he could ensure that the event did not descend into chaos. Every instinct, every lesson, every ounce of experience surged through him. The palace, its secrets, and the young royal's safety all depended on his next move. Thomas Hale, veteran guard, had always known that duty required more than obedience. It required courage, judgment, and the willingness to act when circumstances demanded it. The private ceremony, poised on the edge of darkness, had just provided the stage, and Thomas, as ever, would step forward to meet it. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the ceremonial hall, exaggerating every movement, every flicker of emotion. Thomas Hale remained vigilant, eyes sweeping the room, senses heightened. The subtle disturbances he had noticed earlier were no longer minor. They had coalesced into a palpable tension that charged the air like static before a storm. The Queen's voice, once measured and confident, had begun to falter, betraying the slightest unease that her carefully orchestrated plan might not unfold as intended. It started with the documents on the pedestal. A sudden gust from a half-open window sent them fluttering, the crisp parchment shaking under the weight of secrecy it carried. Thomas reacted instantly, moving forward with precise, controlled steps to secure the papers before they could scatter across the marble floor. The Queen's eyes followed him, sharp and assessing, a flicker of surprise and acknowledgement passing over her features. She did not speak, but the subtle nod she offered was both a warning and a recognition. The ceremony was no longer entirely within her control. Then came the second sign, a muffled gasp from a young aide near the far end of the hall. Thomas's head snapped toward the sound. The aide had stumbled, nearly dropping a ceremonial chalice. Thomas reached out in a flash, steadying the object and preventing a clatter that could have triggered panic among the attending staff. His heart raced, but his expression remained calm, a pillar of stability amid the growing unease. The Queen's gaze followed his movements, sharp and deliberate, calculating the consequences of his intervention even as she tried to maintain the illusion of control. It was in that instant that the first direct threat became evident. A shadow moved behind the dais, subtle but deliberate, the presence of someone unaccounted for. Thomas's trained eyes caught it immediately. A palace staff member, previously unnoticed, was creeping toward the ceremonial items. Their hands trembled slightly, suggesting either fear or intent to interfere. Thomas shifted silently, hand hovering over his ceremonial sword, ready to intercept should the need arise. Every instinct screamed that this was no ordinary mistake. It was the first step in a potential crisis. "Stop!" Thomas barked, voice low but commanding, and the figure froze. The hall seemed to hold its breath. The aides nearby glanced toward him, uncertainty and fear etched on their faces. The queen's posture remained elegant, composed, but the slight tightening of her jaw betrayed her awareness that the ceremony was no longer proceeding according to plan. The tension was a living thing in the room, stretching across every corner, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight. Thomas advanced carefully, eyes locked on the intruder. "Step back," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. "Now." The figure hesitated, then, realizing Thomas's unwavering resolve, retreated a few steps. The momentary pause allowed Thomas to assess the full scope of the disruption. The ceremonial hall, designed to be controlled and predictable, had become a stage for uncertainty, and every participant was acutely aware that the balance could collapse at any moment. The queen, observing from the dais, spoke finally, her voice sharp and commanding. "Thomas, handle this discreetly. I will not have chaos overshadowing my ceremony." There was authority in her tone, but also the subtle edge of fear, fear that the event she had meticulously planned might spiral beyond her control. Thomas nodded, acknowledging her command, while recognizing that discretion and protection now meant more than simple obedience. A sudden clatter echoed from the far side of the hall. One of the aides had dropped a ceremonial sword, the polished metal clanging against the marble floor. Heads turned, breaths caught in throats. Thomas moved instantly, picking up the sword and securing it safely, maintaining the ritual's continuity without alerting the queen or the others to the extent of the disruption. Every step he took, every motion, was a calculated effort to stabilize the ceremony without inflaming the tension further. Then came the most alarming sign. A small fire had ignited in a candle sconce near the edge of the dais, likely dislodged during the earlier disturbances. Smoke began to curl upward, its scent sharp and acrid. Thomas reacted instantly, extinguishing the flame with a ceremonial cloth, all the while keeping his eyes on the queen. Camilla's gaze flicked toward him, a flash of relief mingled with irritation, as if silently acknowledging that the veteran guard had prevented disaster while simultaneously challenging her authority. As the smoke cleared, the queen's tone shifted, colder now, more deliberate. "Thomas," she said, voice low but biting, "you presume to control what I have arranged. This ceremony is mine, and I will not have interference, no matter how well-intentioned." There was a subtle threat beneath the words, an assertion of power meant to remind him of his place. Thomas, however, did not falter. His resolve had been forged over decades of service, and he knew that the protection of the royal family, especially the vulnerable young royals, outweighed deference to ceremonial authority. "I am here to ensure order and safety, Your Majesty," Thomas replied evenly, voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Your ceremony may be private, but any threat, whether from accident, oversight, or intent, cannot go unchecked. I cannot allow harm to come to anyone under my protection." His words carried the weight of experience and moral clarity. The aides exchanged glances, silently recognizing the authority inherent in his actions and the courage behind them. Camilla's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the polished veneer of control slipped entirely. "So, you would challenge me?" she asked, her tone icy. "You would assert your authority over mine?" There was danger in her question, a test designed to gauge the limits of his loyalty and courage. Thomas met her gaze steadily, unwavering, aware that his next move could determine not only the outcome of the ceremony but also the perception of his duty and honor. Before either could act further, a muffled shout erupted from the side corridor. A servant had stumbled upon a minor accident, an overturned tray of ceremonial items that threatened to draw attention from the staff gathered outside. Thomas's mind raced. The moment demanded action, immediate, decisive, and protective. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, intercepting the tray before it could spill, simultaneously issuing a calm but authoritative command to the aides to maintain their positions. The queen's expression softened ever so slightly, a grudging acknowledgement of his competence, yet the tension remained. She was fully aware that the ceremony, intended to be controlled in private, had already been disrupted, and that the veteran guard had taken steps to prevent further escalation. Thomas recognized that the delicate balance between obedience and moral action had been tested, and he had passed the first trial. Yet the subtle disturbances were far from over. The hidden threats, the trembling aides, and the unpredictable elements within the room suggested that the ceremony's dark turn was only beginning. Thomas's instincts screamed that further challenges awaited, each one demanding vigilance, courage, and unwavering adherence to duty. He understood that the choices he made now would define not only his reputation, but the safety and stability of the royal household. Thomas Hale had always known that service to the palace required more than obedience. It demanded moral clarity, courage in the face of authority, and a willingness to act decisively when circumstances endangered those under his protection. As the Queen resumed the ceremony, carefully controlling her voice and gestures, Thomas remained at the ready, prepared for whatever threat or disturbance might emerge next. Every flicker of candlelight, every shuffle of a robe, every whispered instruction carried significance. The private ceremony, initially serene and controlled, had become a stage for tension, testing both the authority of the Queen and the resolve of the veteran guard. Thomas's presence, unwavering and vigilant, ensured that the balance, though precarious, had not yet collapsed. And in that charged moment, Thomas knew that the dark turn of the ceremony was far from concluded. He would face further challenges, moral dilemmas, and perhaps even confrontation with the Queen herself. But one truth remained undeniable. He would step forward, unwavering, to protect the royal family and maintain the order that so many relied upon. The ceremonial hall hung in a taut silence, every flicker of candlelight casting long shadows that stretched across the polished marble. Thomas Hale remained poised, eyes sweeping the room, ready to react at the first sign of disruption. The minor disturbances earlier had escalated, revealing a darker undercurrent in the Queen's private ceremony. A misstep could unravel hours of preparation, expose secrets, or endanger the young royals and palace staff. Thomas knew that the next moments would demand his full presence, courage tempered by experience, and the moral clarity that had guided him throughout his service. Camilla stood on the dais, her expression composed but alert, eyes flicking toward Thomas as if silently measuring his resolve. The aides, who had been trembling and hesitant moments before, now relied on him more than they realized. The tray of ceremonial items had been secured, the documents stabilized, and the small fire extinguished, but the tension in the room was far from dissipated. Thomas's gaze remained steady, every nerve attuned to the subtle shifts in energy, every movement calculated to maintain order without causing alarm. Suddenly, a sharp clatter erupted from the far corner. One of the aides had stumbled, dropping a small, gilded box that had been intended as part of the ritual. Thomas moved instantly, intercepting the box before it hit the floor. The Queen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing her features, but she quickly masked it with calm. "Thomas," she said softly, almost a whisper, "you intervene too much. Control is mine to wield." "I am here to protect the ceremony and those within it," Thomas replied evenly, voice carrying authority without disrespect. "Order must be maintained, or the consequences could reach beyond this hall." His words, though measured, carried the weight of decades of service and an unwavering commitment to the royal family. The aides exchanged glances, recognizing the quiet authority in his tone and the decisive actions he had taken to prevent further disruption. A sudden movement at the back of the room drew Thomas's attention. A shadowed figure, previously unnoticed, had crept forward, attempting to approach the dais. Thomas's heart tightened. The figure moved with purpose, but hesitation betrayed fear or uncertainty. Without hesitation, Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself between the intruder and the Queen. "Halt!" he commanded firmly, hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. "Step back immediately." The figure froze, eyes wide, recognizing the resolve in Thomas's stance. The Queen's gaze flicked toward him, a subtle acknowledgement of both his intervention and the growing tension. For the first time, Thomas sensed that Camilla understood the depth of his loyalty, the unyielding nature of his vigilance, and the lengths to which he would go to maintain order and protect those under his charge. Then came the critical moment. The queen extended her hand toward the ceremonial items, attempting to regain control of the situation. Her voice, sharp and commanding, echoed across the hall. "Thomas, you overstep. This is my ceremony." There was danger in her tone, a warning that defiance would not be tolerated lightly. But Thomas did not flinch. His decades of training and moral clarity had prepared him for this precise scenario. "I will ensure no harm comes to anyone here, Your Majesty," he replied firmly. "That includes the integrity of the ceremony, the safety of the aides, and the protection of the royal family. My duty compels me to act." The hall seemed to hold its breath. The queen, poised yet momentarily unguarded, assessed his unwavering gaze and realized that she was facing not only a loyal servant but a moral force unwilling to compromise. A sudden gasp from one of the junior aides alerted Thomas to another disturbance. A ceremonial candle had tipped dangerously close to the edge of the dais. Without hesitation, Thomas moved, steadying the candle and repositioning it safely. The flame flickered, casting a brief glow on the queen's face, revealing the faintest trace of apprehension. Her hand hovered over the ceremonial box, fingers twitching with the weight of the secret she carried. Yet she remained still, allowing Thomas's actions to stabilize the situation. The young aides began to regain composure, inspired by the veteran guard's calm authority. They moved with renewed precision, arranging ceremonial items and assisting in the ritual, their previous fear tempered by his unwavering presence. The balance of the hall, once threatened by small disturbances, was gradually restored. The queen's voice softened, her tone controlled, as she continued the ceremony with a heightened awareness of Thomas's intervention. Thomas, however, remained alert. He knew that the dark turn of the ceremony had not ended. Hidden threats, whether intentional or accidental, still lingered. Every shadow, every whispered instruction, every subtle movement of the queen or her attendants could signal another disruption. He maintained his vigilance, eyes scanning the room, ready to act with both precision and moral clarity. Then came the decisive moment. The queen reached for the ceremonial documents and lifted the gilded box. Thomas noticed a slight hesitation in her movements, a flicker of doubt, or perhaps recognition that her authority was now shared with someone willing to act when circumstances demanded it. In that instant, he stepped slightly forward, not to seize control, but to provide a stabilizing presence. His posture conveyed respect, yet authority, ensuring that the queen could proceed without further mishap. The ceremony continued, now tense but orderly. Thomas's presence served as both shield and stabilizer, allowing the queen to complete her ritual without additional incident. The aides moved with precision, the documents remained secure, and the ceremonial items were arranged with meticulous care. The tension, once threatening to erupt, was contained thanks to the veteran guard's courage, vigilance, and unwavering commitment. As the final words of the ceremony were spoken, Camilla lowered her hands, a faint exhale escaping her lips. Thomas stood at attention, eyes scanning for any remaining threat. The hall was calm, yet the memory of the disruptions lingered. The queen's gaze met his once more, a subtle nod of acknowledgement and respect passing between them. Though the private ceremony had taken a dark turn, it had been preserved, and the integrity of the palace maintained. Yet, even in this moment of resolution, a shadow of uncertainty remained. Thomas's instincts, honed over decades, told him that this was not the end. The disturbances, the secrets, the subtle tension within the queen's carefully orchestrated ritual hinted at challenges yet to come. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the balance of power, loyalty, and secrecy was fragile, and that Thomas Hale's vigilance would be required again. As he stepped back from the dais, Thomas glanced toward the exit. Beyond the ceremonial hall, corridors stretched into shadows, each one potentially concealing threats, intrigue, or unforeseen complications. He knew that his duty extended far beyond this moment. Protecting the royal family, ensuring the integrity of palace rituals, and maintaining order in the face of hidden dangers were ongoing responsibilities. The dark turn of the queen's private ceremony had been mitigated, but vigilance would always be required. And then, from the corner of his eye, Thomas caught a fleeting movement. A figure, half hidden in shadow, retreated swiftly from the hall, His pulse quickened. Whatever the figure carried, or whatever knowledge they possessed, it was now a variable that Thomas had to consider. The palace, the royal family, and the secrets they safeguarded were once again at risk. The veteran guard's work was far from over. Thomas squared his shoulders, eyes sharp and unwavering. He had acted decisively, protected the ceremony, and ensured the safety of those present. But the shadows beyond the hall promised that more challenges were coming, challenges that would test his courage, judgment, and loyalty to their limits. The palace had survived this dark turn, but the story was far from concluded. In that charged moment, Thomas Hale understood one immutable truth. Vigilance, courage, and moral clarity were the shields of the palace, and he would stand unwavering, ready to confront whatever darkness emerged next. The ceremony had ended, yet the tension lingered, a promise that the royal family's trials were only beginning. The hall fell silent once more, candles flickering, shadows stretching, and the palace holding its breath. Thomas remained alert, every sense attuned, prepared to step forward the moment the next threat emerged. The queen had completed her ritual, but the consequences of the dark turn, the secrets it hinted at, and the unknown figure in the shadows ensured that the palace and its loyal guard would face further tests, and Thomas, veteran and steadfast, would be ready.